The man living in my attic. The first night. It started with a sound. Not a loud crash. Not something obvious. Just a slow, dragging noise above my ceiling. At first I thought it was nothing. Old houses make strange sounds all the time. Wood expands, pipes shift, animals crawl into places they shouldn't. But this sound was different, because it sounded like footsteps. And footsteps mean one thing. Someone was walking above me. My name is Daniel Carter, and this happened to me in Columbus, Ohio, in the fall of 2022. I had just moved into a small rental house at the edge of the city. The house was old, probably built sometime in the 1950s, but it was cheap. After a rough breakup and losing my previous apartment, cheap was exactly what I needed. The landlord was a quiet older man named Mr. Hawthorne. When he handed me the keys, he said something strange. "Let me know if you hear anything unusual." I laughed when he said it. Old houses always make noise. But now I wish I had asked him what he meant. The first day went smoothly. I spent most of the afternoon unpacking boxes and setting up the basics. The living room had hardwood floors that creaked with almost every step. The kitchen was small but manageable. The bedroom was upstairs, facing a quiet street lined with tall trees. It felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you rarely get in apartment buildings. Around 9 p.m. I ordered pizza, watched Netflix and tried to relax. By midnight I was exhausted. I went upstairs, turned off the lights, and fell asleep almost immediately. But sometime later that night, I woke up. The clock beside my bed read 2:17 a.m. At first I didn't know why I woke up. The room was dark, silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Then I heard it. Thump. Directly above my bedroom. I froze. Maybe something had fallen in the attic. A box maybe. But I hadn't put anything up there. Then it happened again. Thump scrape. Like something heavy shifting across the floor above me. I held my breath. Then I heard something worse. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Walking from one side of the attic to the other. My heart began pounding. Animals run, they scurry, they scratch. But these steps sounded deliberate. Almost careful. Like someone trying not to make noise. I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling. The steps continued. 1, 2, 3. Then they stopped. Right above my room. For several seconds there was complete silence. Then something dragged slowly across the floor again. And whatever it was directly above my bed. The next morning I convinced myself it had to be animals. Raccoons maybe. Old houses attract them. Still, I wanted to check. The attic entrance was a small hatch in the hallway ceiling. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and pushed the panel open. Dust fell immediately. I turned on my phone flashlight and looked inside. Wood beams. Insulation. Spider webs. Nothing else. No animals. No nests. No footprints. Nothing. The attic looked like it hadn't been touched in years. So I closed the hatch and went about my day. But something strange started happening that week. Small things. Things that didn't make sense. Food in my refrigerator started disappearing. A half carton of milk became empty overnight. Bread slices went missing. Once I found my kitchen chair pulled slightly away from the table. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I moved it earlier. But then something happened that I couldn't explain. One night I woke up again. 3:04 a.m. And I heard movement above the ceiling. Not walking this time. Crawling. Slow dragging sounds. like someone moving on their hands and knees. The sound moved slowly across the attic. Then it stopped, right above my bedroom. My entire body went cold. Seconds passed. Then I heard something new. Scratching. Soft. Slow. Like fingernails dragging across wood. I held my breath. And then I heard a whisper. So quiet I almost thought I imagined it. But it was definitely a voice. Human. And it was coming from directly above me. That was the moment I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. Because animals don't whisper. And what I discovered a few days later was far worse than anything I could have imagined. The camera. The whisper stayed in my mind for the entire next day. At first, I tried to convince myself I imagined it. When you wake up in the middle of the night, your brain can play tricks on you. Shadows move. Sounds seem louder than they really are. Sometimes your mind fills in details that were never there. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that explanation made. Because I didn't just hear a sound. I heard a voice. And voices don't come from raccoons. That morning, I walked around the house trying to act normal. I made coffee. I checked emails for work. But every few minutes, my eyes drifted toward the ceiling. Toward the attic. Every creak in the house made my stomach tighten. By noon, I decided to check the attic again. This time more carefully. I grabbed a flashlight from my car and climbed onto the hallway chair again. When I pushed the attic hatch open, the same stale smell drifted down. Old dust, wood, and something else. Something faint I couldn't quite identify. Almost like old fabric or damp insulation. I pulled myself halfway into the attic and shined the flashlight around slowly. The beam cut through floating dust particles. The space looked exactly the same as before. Wood beams. Insulation. Empty space. Nothing moving. Nothing alive. Still, something about it felt different. Like the attic wasn't as empty as it looked. I moved the flashlight beam across the floor. Then something caught my attention. A small area where the dust looked disturbed. Not a footprint exactly. More like something had been dragged across the surface. I crouched down and looked closer. The dust was slightly smeared, as if something heavy had been moved through it. My heart started beating faster. Maybe an animal had been up there after all. But if it was an animal, where did it go? I scanned the attic again. Still nothing. Eventually, I climbed back down and closed the hatch. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about the disturbed dust, about the whisper, about the missing food. Each piece by itself wasn't proof of anything. But together, they formed a picture I didn't want to believe. Still, I needed answers. So after dinner, I drove to a nearby electronics store and bought a cheap motion detection security camera. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a small indoor camera with night vision and motion alerts that connected to my phone. My plan was simple. If something was in the attic, the camera would catch it. And if it was just animals, at least I'd finally know. Around 10 p.m., I climbed into the attic again. This time I brought the camera and a small portable battery pack. I placed the camera on one of the wooden beams facing the open space of the attic. Then I opened the app on my phone to make sure it worked. The screen showed a grainy black and white view of the attic. Empty. Still. Perfect. I left the attic, closed the hatch, and went downstairs. For the first time since moving in, I felt a little relief. Now if something was up there, I'd have proof. Midnight passed quietly. I watched TV until about 12:30 and then went to bed. For a while I actually slept peacefully. But sometime in the early morning, my phone buzzed. The vibration on the nightstand woke me instantly. I reached for the phone. The screen lit up with a notification. Motion detected, attic camera. My stomach dropped. For a few seconds, I just stared at the notification. Part of me didn't want to open it, because once I saw what triggered the motion, there would be no pretending anymore. Finally, I tapped the alert. The live camera feed opened. At first, the screen looked normal. Just the empty attic. Dust floating through the night vision light. Then something moved. At the far edge of the frame. Slowly, almost too slowly to notice. A shape appeared in the darkness. At first, I thought it was a shadow. But shadows don't crawl. Because what I saw next was a hand. A human hand. Gripping the wooden beam. Then another hand appeared. And slowly, a man crawled into view. My entire body went cold. The man looked thin. Unbelievably thin. His clothes were dirty and loose, like he'd been wearing them for weeks. His hair was messy and long, partially covering his face. But what disturbed me most was how he moved. He wasn't walking normally. He was crawling, slowly dragging himself across the attic floor. Like he was trying to stay quiet. The night vision camera made his eyes reflect pale white. And then something happened that made my heart nearly stop. He looked directly into the camera and smiled. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at my phone screen in disbelief. The man crawled closer to the camera. Slow, controlled, almost curious, like he was inspecting it. Then he leaned forward until his face filled the screen. His eyes looked tired, but focused, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Then he spoke. The microphone barely picked it up, but I heard it clearly through my phone speaker. He whispered, "You finally saw me." My heart slammed against my chest. Then the screen suddenly went black. The camera feed disconnected. For a few seconds, I just sat there frozen in my bed. My brain struggled to process what I had just seen. There was a man in my attic. A real person. Someone who had been living above my ceiling. Watching me. Listening to me. Waiting until I slept. Then a sound came from above. Footsteps. Fast ones this time. Running across the attic. And then something even worse. The attic hatch in the hallway started shaking. The handle rattled. Slowly at first. Then harder. Like someone was testing if it would open. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The operator answered almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? My voice barely came out. There's someone in my attic. I whispered. And I think he's trying to come down. The operator told me to stay on the line. Police were on the way. But the nearest patrol unit was about 6 minutes away. 6 minutes. That suddenly felt like a lifetime. Because above me, the hatch kept shaking. And the man on the other side knew I had seen him. The man above me. The attic hatch kept shaking. Not violently. Not like someone trying to break through. But slowly. Deliberately. Like whoever was on the other side was testing it, seeing how strong it was. I stood in the middle of my bedroom, phone pressed to my ear, trying to stay quiet while the 911 operator kept talking to me. "Sir, officers are on the way. Stay calm and keep your distance from the attic entrance." Her voice sounded calm, professional. but the noise above my ceiling made it almost impossible to focus. The footsteps had stopped, and that silence felt worse than the noise, because I didn't know what the man was doing anymore. Was he still at the hatch? Was he watching me through the cracks in the ceiling? Or worse, was he looking for another way down? "Sir, can you move somewhere safe?" the operator asked. I looked around my room. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. No back exit upstairs. Only the staircase that led down into the living room. And the attic hatch was in the hallway right outside my bedroom door, which meant the man in the attic was closer to that staircase than I was. "I'm staying in my bedroom," I whispered. "Okay, lock the door if you can." I rushed over and turned the lock. The click sounded much louder than it should have. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then I heard something above the ceiling. Crawling. The same slow dragging sound from before. But this time it wasn't moving away. It was moving directly above my bedroom. I stared at the ceiling, my heart beating so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The man moved slowly across the attic floor. Then the sound stopped. Right above me. I held my breath. And then I heard something I will never forget. A quiet voice. Directly above my head. "Daniel." My entire body went numb. I hadn't told the police operator my name yet. And I definitely hadn't told the man upstairs. But somehow, he knew it. "Sir, what's happening?" the operator asked. My voice trembled. He said my name. "What?" "The man in the attic, he knows my name." There was a pause on the line. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Officers are about 2 minutes away. Stay inside your room." 2 minutes. I looked up again. The ceiling creaked. And then I heard something sliding slowly across the attic floor. Something heavier than footsteps. Something being dragged. Then suddenly, a loud thud. Right above the bedroom. Dust fell from the ceiling. I backed away from the center of the room instinctively. Because for a moment, I thought the ceiling might collapse. But it didn't. Instead, the house went completely quiet again. 30 seconds passed. Maybe a minute. Then I heard something downstairs. A floorboard creaking. My heart skipped. Because the man had been in the attic. Which meant he couldn't possibly be downstairs. Unless there was another way out of the attic. The operator heard the noise through my phone. "What was that?" she asked. "I think he got down," I whispered. "Stay in your room. Police are arriving now." Right on cue. I heard the sound of sirens outside. Then car doors slamming. Voices shouting commands. "Police, come out with your hands up." Relief flooded through my body, so quickly my legs nearly gave out. But the relief didn't last long. Because the officers searched the house. And they didn't find anyone. About 5 minutes later, one of the officers knocked on my bedroom door. "Sir, it's the police. You can come out now." I opened the door slowly. 2 officers stood in the hallway. Flashlights in their hands. Both looking serious. "Are you Daniel?" one asked. I nodded. "You said someone was in your attic." "Yes," I said quickly. "I saw him on the camera." They exchanged a glance. "Let's take a look." We walked to the attic hatch together. One officer pulled the panel open, while the other pointed his flashlight upward. "Anyone up there?" he called. No answer. He climbed into the attic carefully. Then the second officer followed. I waited below, my heart racing. About 30 seconds later, the first officer called down. "You better come see this." I climbed up halfway and looked inside. At first it just looked like a normal attic. But then the flashlight beam moved to the far corner. And I saw it. A sleeping bag. Old. Dirty. Spread out on the wooden floor. Next to it were empty food wrappers, plastic water bottles, and a small flashlight. The man had been living there. For days. Maybe weeks. Watching me. Listening to me. Waiting for me to sleep. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the sleeping bag. Or the trash. It was something else. Something scratched into one of the wooden beams. The officer moved his flashlight closer. And the words became clear. They were carved into the wood with something sharp. 3 simple words. I live here. The officers searched the attic again. Then the backyard. Then the entire street. But the man was gone. One of the officers eventually turned to me. You're lucky you called when you did. Why? I asked. He looked back toward the attic. Then said quietly, because whoever was living up there, he wasn't just hiding. He paused, then finished the sentence. He was studying you. That night I didn't sleep at all. And the worst part, the police told me something before they left. Something that made the situation even more terrifying. Because the man in the attic had probably been there long before I moved in. And the previous tenant, the one who suddenly left the house, no one had heard from him. In almost 3 months. The missing tenant. After the police left, the house felt different. Not just quiet, but empty in a way that made every sound feel wrong. The officers had searched the entire property. They checked the attic twice, walked around the backyard, even looked down the street with flashlights. But the man was gone. Like he had vanished. Before leaving, one of the officers gave me a piece of advice. If you hear anything again tonight, call us immediately. I nodded, but deep down I knew something they didn't. The man had been living in my attic. For days. Maybe weeks. Which meant he knew the house better than anyone. Maybe even better than me. I locked every door and window before midnight. Then I pushed a chair under the doorknob of my bedroom door. It probably wouldn't stop someone determined to get in. But it made me feel slightly safer. Still, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed with the lights on, staring at the ceiling. Waiting. Listening. Every creak in the house made my stomach tighten. But the attic stayed silent. For hours. Around 3 a.m., something finally happened. Not in the attic, but outside. A car slowly drove past the house. Its headlights moved across my bedroom wall before disappearing down the street. Then everything went quiet again. And that's when a thought suddenly crossed my mind. Something the officer had said earlier. About the previous tenant. Before leaving, the officer had asked me a question. How long have you lived here? About a week, I answered. He nodded slowly. Then said something strange. The last tenant moved out pretty suddenly. Yeah, I said, the landlord mentioned that. The officer looked toward the attic before responding. Did he tell you why he moved out? I shook my head. And the officer didn't say anything else. At the time, I didn't think much about it. But now, sitting alone in the middle of the night, it bothered me. The next morning, I decided to call the landlord. Mr. Hawthorne answered after a few rings. Hello. Hi, it's Daniel, from the Maple Street house. Oh, Daniel, he said calmly, everything all right? I hesitated. Then I said the words. There was someone living in the attic. The line went silent. For several seconds. Long enough to make my heart race again. Then he finally spoke. What? I explained everything. The noises, the camera footage, the police finding the sleeping bag. When I finished, he sighed heavily. That's concerning. Concerned. That was the word he chose. Not shocked. Not surprised. Concerned. And that made me suspicious. Did something like this happen before? I asked. Another pause. Then he said quietly, the previous tenant complained about noises too. My stomach tightened. What kind of noises? Footsteps in the attic, he said. Did you check it? Of course, he replied, but we didn't find anything. So why did he move out? Mr. Hawthorne hesitated again, then said something that made my skin crawl. He said someone was living in the house. I felt cold. Did he have proof? He claimed he saw someone watching him through the attic hatch one night. My heart started racing again, because that sounded exactly like what happened to me. What happened to him? I asked. But the landlord didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded uneasy. We haven't heard from him since he moved out. That sentence stayed in my mind the entire day. We haven't heard from him. That didn't sound like someone who simply moved to another apartment. It sounded like someone who disappeared. Later that afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I went back up into the attic. The sleeping bag was still there. The police had left it as evidence. The carved words on the beam were still visible. I live here. But something else caught my attention. Near the sleeping bag was a small pile of papers. I hadn't noticed them the night before. They looked like notebook pages. I picked one up carefully. At first it looked like random writing. But then I realized what it was. They were notes. Notes about me. My heart began pounding as I read them. One page said, Daniel leaves for work at 8:10 a.m. Another said, he orders food at night, usually around 9. Another, bedroom lights off around midnight. My hands started shaking. The man in the attic had been watching me, studying my routine, learning my habits. Then I found the last page. And this one was different. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic. The words repeated several times across the page. Not the first. Not the first. Not the first. At the bottom of the page was a name. A different name. Mark Jensen. The previous tenant. Suddenly, everything made sense. The man in the attic had been watching him first, studying him, learning his routine, just like he was studying me, which meant one terrifying possibility. The previous tenant didn't just move out. Something happened to him. Something inside this house. That night I packed a bag. I planned to leave the next morning. I didn't care about the lease anymore. No amount of cheap rent was worth this. But around midnight, while I was sitting in the living room, I heard something again. A sound I hadn't heard since the police came. Footsteps. Above the ceiling. My entire body froze. Slow. Careful. Walking across the attic floor. The man had come back. And this time, I knew he wasn't just hiding. He was returning home. The final night. The footsteps had returned. Slow. Heavy. Walking across the attic floor. For a few seconds I just sat there in the living room, frozen, staring at the ceiling. The man had come back. After the police searched the house. After they found his sleeping bag. After he knew that I had seen him. Which meant one thing. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. And that thought alone made my stomach twist. I slowly stood up from the couch. The sound above me continued. One step, then another, moving slowly across the attic floor like he was packing. Like he was thinking. I grabbed my phone from the table. My hands were shaking again. I thought about calling the police immediately. But something stopped me. Because this time, the footsteps stopped directly above the living room. Right above me. Then something new happened. A soft knock. 3 taps. Knock, knock, knock. From the attic floor. Like someone was knocking on a door. But the door was the ceiling. And I was standing directly under it. My heart began pounding so loudly, I could hear it in my ears. Then a voice came from above. Soft. Calm. Almost friendly. Daniel. I felt every muscle in my body lock. Because I knew that voice. It was the same voice from the camera. The man from the attic. Daniel, the voice said again. You're still here. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My brain was screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. Then he spoke again. You read my notes. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Which meant he knew I had been in the attic. He knew I had seen everything. The ceiling creaked again. And suddenly, something began sliding across the attic floor. Something heavy. Dragged slowly across the wood. Then it stopped. Right above the attic hatch. My eyes moved toward the hallway. Toward the ceiling panel that led to the attic. And that's when it happened. The hatch moved. Just slightly. The edge lifted. Then stopped. Like someone was testing it again. My instincts finally kicked in. I grabbed my car keys and ran for the front door. Behind me, the attic hatch suddenly slammed open. The loud crack echoed through the hallway. I didn't look back. I just ran. I burst outside into the cold night air. My car was parked in the driveway. I jumped inside and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the keys trying to start the engine. Then I looked up and saw something that made my blood run cold. The attic window. At the top of the house. A small dark square above the roofline. And in that window, a face. Watching me. The same thin man from the camera. His head tilted slightly. And he was smiling. I started the car and sped down the street without looking back. That night I drove straight to a hotel across town. And I never went back to that house again. The police returned to the property the next morning. They searched the attic again. The backyard. The neighborhood. But the man was gone. Just like before. The sleeping bag was still there. The food wrappers. The carved message in the beam. But the man himself had disappeared. Like he had simply melted into the night. A few days later, the police contacted me again. They had discovered something disturbing. Something that connected everything together. The previous tenant. Mark Jensen. The man whose name I found on the note. He had officially been reported missing. 3 months earlier. The police searched the house one more time. This time more carefully. And that's when they found something hidden inside the attic insulation. A small wallet. Inside it was an ID card. Driver's license. And the name on it was Mark Jensen. But the strangest part came later. Weeks later. After I had already moved to a different apartment. Far away from that house. One night I received an email. No subject line. No sender name. Just an attachment. A video file. I opened it. and immediately felt my chest tighten, because it was footage from the attic camera, the same camera I had installed. But it wasn't the clip I had seen before. This video was older, longer, and it showed something I had never noticed. The camera was recording the empty attic, just like before. Dust floating in the air, nothing moving. Then suddenly, someone climbed into the attic. But it wasn't the thin man. It was someone else. A normal-looking guy. Confused. Looking around. Holding a flashlight. And I recognized him instantly, because I had seen his photo in the missing person report. It was Mark Jensen. He walked across the attic slowly, examining the sleeping bag, the trash, the carved message. Then suddenly, the camera shifted slightly, like someone behind it had touched it. And Mark froze, because he heard something behind him. Footsteps. Then a voice spoke from the darkness. The same voice I heard. Calm. Soft. Whispering. Welcome home. Mark turned quickly. The flashlight beam moved across the attic, but the camera angle didn't show the person behind him. Only Mark's terrified face. Then the video suddenly ended. I stared at the screen in silence, because there was one final detail in the email. A short message below the video. Just one sentence. And it made my blood run cold. It said, "I told you I live here." He never left. For weeks after I left the house on Maple Street, I tried to convince myself that it was over. I had moved into a small apartment across town. New building. Security cameras. Neighbors everywhere. The exact opposite of that quiet, isolated house. At first, things felt normal again. I went back to work. Started sleeping better. Stopped checking the ceiling every few minutes. But the memory of that house never completely left my mind. Especially the last email. The video of Mark Jensen. And the message at the bottom. "I told you I live here." The police investigated the email. They traced the IP address. But it led nowhere. The signal came from a public Wi-Fi network at a coffee shop downtown. No cameras captured who sent it. No fingerprints were found on the video file. It was like the message had been sent by someone who knew exactly how to stay invisible. After a while, the investigation slowed down. Eventually, it stopped completely. Mark Jensen's case remained open, but there were no leads. No suspect. No explanation. And officially, the man from the attic didn't exist. But I knew he was real. I had seen him. He had spoken to me. And he knew my name. About a month after I moved out, I received another call. This time it was from the landlord. Mr. Hawthorne. His voice sounded uneasy. "Daniel," he said, "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it?" I replied. "Did you ever go back to the house?" "No," I said immediately. "Why?" There was a long pause on the line. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Because the neighbors reported seeing someone inside." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "They said the lights were on late at night." "But the house is empty," I said. "I know," he replied quietly. The landlord eventually hired a security company to inspect the property. 2 guards arrived at the house late one evening. They checked every room. The basement. The attic. Everything. But they didn't find anyone. The house was completely empty. Until the next night. One of the security guards called the landlord at around 2:40 a.m. His voice was shaking. He said he heard footsteps. Coming from the attic, the guard climbed up to check. And when he reached the attic, he found something new. Something that hadn't been there before. A fresh message carved into the wooden beam, right below the old one. The first message still read, "I live here." But beneath it, a second message had appeared. 3 new words, carved deeper into the wood. "You left." When I heard that, I felt a cold chill run through my body. Because the message wasn't just a statement. It felt personal, like it was meant for me. After that, the landlord decided to sell the house. The property stayed on the market for several weeks. Eventually, a young couple bought it. They moved in during early winter. New furniture, fresh paint. They renovated almost everything, trying to turn the place into a normal home again. For a while, nothing happened. Months passed. No strange noises. No reports of anything unusual. Eventually, the story of the attic man faded. Just another strange incident that people slowly forgot. Until 6 months later, when the police received a phone call from the new owners. The husband sounded terrified. He told the dispatcher that someone was inside their house, living in the attic. When the police arrived, they searched the house carefully. Just like before, they climbed into the attic. And once again, they found evidence someone had been living there. Sleeping bag, food wrappers, water bottles, the exact same signs. But this time they found something else. Something that had never been there before. A small camera, mounted on one of the wooden beams, pointed directly toward the attic hatch. The police reviewed the footage, and what they saw made the situation even more disturbing. Because the footage showed something terrifying. The attic had never been empty. Not even once. The recordings went back months. Even before the new couple moved in. Even before I lived there. Even before Mark Jensen disappeared. And in every single video, there was someone in the attic. Watching. Waiting. Moving quietly through the darkness. But the worst part wasn't the footage. It was the final recording. The most recent one. Recorded just hours before the police arrived. The camera showed the attic. Silent. Still. Empty. For several minutes nothing happened. Then slowly, a man crawled into view. Thin. Dirty. Long messy hair. The same man I had seen before. He moved toward the camera, then leaned close to the lens, his pale eyes reflecting in the night vision. And he whispered something. Something the police later included in their report. 3 quiet words. Still my house. The police searched for him again. But like every other time, he disappeared. No fingerprints. No identity. No trace of where he came from. Or where he went. The house on Maple Street is still standing today. People still live there. Families. Couples. Tenants who move in and out every few years. Most of them never notice anything strange. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report hearing footsteps above the ceiling. And occasionally, someone claims they heard a whisper coming from the attic, a quiet voice saying the same thing every time. I live here, plus the truth inside the walls. After the police discovered the camera in the attic, the case reopened. At least temporarily. Detectives returned to the house on Maple Street and began searching the property again. But this time, they searched everything. Not just the attic. The walls. The floors. even the crawl space under the house, because something about the situation didn't make sense. If the man had been living there for so long, how had no one ever seen him enter or leave? The detectives started asking a different question. What if he never left the house at all? 3 days into the investigation, they brought in a structural inspector. The house was old, built sometime in the late 1950s, and older homes sometimes have strange hidden spaces, unused crawl areas, maintenance tunnels, old storage cavities inside the walls. At first, the inspector didn't find anything unusual. But when he reached the hallway outside the attic hatch, he noticed something strange. The wall sounded hollow. One of the detectives knocked on it again. The sound echoed deeper than expected. So they removed part of the drywall. And what they discovered behind it made everyone in the room fall silent. There was a narrow passageway inside the wall, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The tunnel ran vertically between the attic and the space behind the living room wall. And inside the passage, they found more evidence. Old blankets, food cans, plastic bottles, and dozens of small notebooks. Whoever had been living in the attic had also been living inside the walls. The notebooks were the most disturbing part, because they contained years of notes, detailed observations about every tenant who had ever lived in the house. What time they woke up, when they left for work, what they watched on television, what they ate, even private conversations written down word for word. The earliest notebook was dated 2009, which meant the man in the attic had possibly been living there for over 10 years. Watching, waiting, studying people. But the last notebook was different, because it contained something personal, something written about me. One of the detectives later showed me a photo of the page. My name was written across the top. Daniel Carter. Below it were notes. New tenant. Moves quietly. Checks attic. Then the final line at the bottom of the page, written darker than the rest. He's curious. When I saw that, a chill ran through my body, because it meant something terrifying. The man in the attic hadn't just been watching me. He had been evaluating me. The investigation continued for another week. Police searched the tunnel carefully, but it eventually ended behind a loose panel in the basement wall. A hidden exit, which meant the man had multiple ways to move around the house without ever being seen. But one question still remained. Who was he? There were no fingerprints, no DNA matches in the system, no missing persons reports that fit his description. It was like he didn't exist. Then a detective made a disturbing discovery. One of the oldest notebooks mentioned a name. Not a tenant, a different name, written several times across multiple pages. Thomas Hale. The detectives dug deeper, and eventually they found something. In the city records. In 2008, the house on Maple Street had been owned by a man named Thomas Hale. He lived there alone. Neighbors described him as quiet, reclusive, strange. Then one day, he disappeared. There was no investigation, no missing person report, because officially, Thomas Hale had simply moved away. At least that's what the records said. But the more detectives looked into his history, the more disturbing things became. Thomas Hale had been a construction worker, specifically a remodeling contractor, which meant he had the knowledge to build hidden spaces inside houses, including tunnels. And suddenly, the entire story started to make sense. Because if Thomas Hale had built those passages himself, He wouldn't need to enter the house. He was already inside it. The man in the attic might not have been a stranger. He might have been the original owner of the house, a man who never truly left. When I heard that theory, I felt sick, because it meant something horrifying. Thomas Hale had been living inside those walls for over a decade, watching every person who moved into the house, studying them, observing their lives like some twisted experiment. But the story didn't end there, because 2 weeks after the investigation stopped, I received one final message. It arrived in the middle of the night. Another email. No sender. No subject. Just a photo. The image was dark, grainy, taken from what looked like a hidden camera. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. Then I realized something. The photo showed my new apartment. Specifically, my bedroom. And in the corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows near the ceiling, was a familiar shape. A small square vent, just big enough for someone to watch through. Below the photo was a message. Only 5 words. You moved again. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had ever really escaped. The man who watches. For a long time after receiving that photo, I didn't move. I just sat there on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone screen. My bedroom. My apartment. The place I thought was finally safe. And yet the picture proved something terrifying. Someone had been inside. Or at least close enough to see inside. Close enough to watch me. Again. The message under the photo kept repeating in my mind. You moved again. Not you moved. Not nice apartment. But again. Like whoever sent it had been watching me long before I ever lived in that house. Like my life wasn't something new to him. It was just another chapter in something that had already been happening. For a long time, I stood up slowly and began checking my apartment. Closet, bathroom, kitchen, every room, every corner. I even checked the air vents. But there was nothing there. No cameras. No signs of anyone hiding. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Because the photo existed, which meant someone had taken it. The next morning, I went to the police. I showed them the email and the photo. The detective studying the case sighed when he saw it. Another anonymous message, he asked. Yes, I said. And the location in the photo. My apartment. He looked at the image carefully, then shook his head. This could have been taken from outside. But it shows my bedroom, I said. And my bedroom window faces the back of the building. The detective didn't answer. He just leaned back in his chair and looked tired. Eventually, he said something that made my stomach twist. Daniel, we searched the Maple Street house completely. And we didn't find anyone. I stared at him. You found the tunnels. Yes. You found the notebooks. Yes. But you didn't find the man, he finished quietly. That was the problem. No matter how much evidence existed, there was never a person. No identity. No body. No suspect. Just traces. Like a ghost that left footprints. For the next few days, I barely slept. Every small sound in my apartment made me jump. Footsteps in the hallway. Neighbors closing doors. The elevator moving between floors. Everything felt suspicious. Because I couldn't stop thinking about something. The tunnels inside the walls. If Thomas Hale had built those passages inside his house, what stopped him from building others? In other buildings. In other homes. A week passed. Then something strange happened. One evening, I returned from work and noticed something on my kitchen table. A small object. Something that definitely hadn't been there that morning. A key. It was an old brass key. The kind used for older houses. Attached to it was a small paper tag. My heart started pounding before I even picked it up, because I already knew something was wrong. The tag had handwriting on it. Messy. Uneven. But I recognized the style immediately. The same handwriting from the attic notebooks. 3 words were written on the paper. For your next home. I felt my hands start shaking, because the front door had been locked when I entered, which meant one terrifying thing. Someone had been inside my apartment again. That night, I didn't stay there. I packed a bag and left immediately. Checked into another hotel, the third place I had stayed since leaving Maple Street. And as I sat alone in the hotel room, something terrible finally became clear to me. Something I hadn't fully understood before. The man in the attic wasn't attached to the house. He was attached to me. I wasn't just another tenant. I was something else. Something he had chosen. Something he was following. That realization made something inside me shift. Because suddenly, I didn't feel like prey anymore. I felt like someone being hunted. And hunters don't stop. They don't lose interest. They don't disappear. They wait. They watch. And eventually, they move closer. Later that night, I received another email. Just like the others. No sender name. No subject. Just one sentence. You're harder to watch now. And below the message, a second line appeared. A line that made my blood run cold. But I'm getting closer. The hidden room. After the message that said, I'm getting closer, I stopped believing in coincidences. By that point, I had moved 3 times. First, the Maple Street house. Then the apartment across town. Now a hotel. And still, the messages continued. The photos continued. Which meant something terrifying. The man watching me didn't need to live in my attic anymore. He had already learned everything he needed. I barely slept that night in the hotel. Every sound in the hallway made me look toward the door. People walking past. Elevator chimes. Doors closing. Everything sounded like someone approaching. But morning eventually came. And for the first time in weeks, something unexpected happened. The police called me. Daniel, the detective, said, we might have found something. My heart jumped. What kind of something? It's about Thomas Hale. The name alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. What about him? We found a property he owned before Maple Street. The detective explained that before living in the Maple Street house, Thomas Hale had owned another property across town. A small, abandoned duplex that had been empty for years. Apparently, the place had been condemned due to structural issues. No one had lived there since 2010. But when investigators checked the records, they discovered something strange. Electricity was still being used inside the building. Not a lot, just small amounts, but enough to suggest someone had been there recently. That afternoon, I met the detective outside the building. The duplex looked worse than I expected. Broken windows. Peeling paint. The front yard was overgrown with weeds. It looked like the kind of place no one would willingly enter. But the detective opened the door anyway. And we stepped inside. The air smelled stale and damp. Dust covered everything. Furniture left behind from years ago. But one thing immediately stood out. There were footprints. Fresh ones. The detective's flashlight moved slowly across the floor. "Someone been here recently," he said quietly. We moved deeper into the house, through the hallway, past an old kitchen, into the back room. And that's when we saw it. The wall had been opened, just like the tunnels inside the Maple Street house. A narrow passage led into the darkness behind the walls. And inside the passage, there were lights, small battery-powered lamps, still turned on. The detective crouched and looked inside. Then he whispered something under his breath. "What?" I asked. "You should see this." I stepped closer, and what I saw made my entire body go cold. Inside the hidden space, there was a room. Not just a tunnel. A room. The walls were covered with photos. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Pictures of different houses, different streets, different people. But the center wall was covered with photos of me. My apartment, my workplace, my car, even pictures of me walking down the street. I felt my legs go weak, because some of the photos were old, older than the Maple Street house, which meant something impossible. The man had been watching me before I ever moved there. The detective pulled one photo off the wall, then another, and another. Each one had a date written on the back. Some of them went back 2 years. "That's impossible," I whispered. The detective didn't answer, because he was staring at something else. Something on a desk in the corner of the hidden room. A notebook. He opened it slowly and began flipping through the pages. Every page contained the same thing. Observations, notes, schedules, descriptions of my daily life. But the final page was different, because it contained a plan. At the top of the page were 3 words, written darker than the rest. Phase 2. Below it was a sentence that made my heart stop. "He's ready." I looked around the hidden room again. The photos, the notes, the years of watching. And suddenly, something became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't a man hiding in attics. This was something else. Something deliberate. Something planned. I wasn't just being watched. I was being prepared. But for what? That question stayed in my mind the entire time we left the building. And as we stepped outside, the detective's phone suddenly buzzed. He looked down at the screen. Then his face went pale. "What is it?" I asked. He slowly turned the phone toward me. It was a security camera alert. From the condemned duplex. The hidden room. The one we had just left. And the notification said something chilling. Motion detected. The last door. The phone in the detective's hand kept vibrating. Motion detected. Inside the hidden room. The same room we had just left minutes ago. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The abandoned duplex stood silent behind us. Broken windows. Dark hallways. And somewhere inside that building, something had just moved. The detective looked back toward the house slowly. "That camera shouldn't be detecting anything," he said quietly. "No one's supposed to be inside." My chest tightened. Maybe someone followed us. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his flashlight again. "Stay behind me." We stepped back toward the building. The front door creaked as we pushed it open again. The inside felt colder this time. Darker. Like the house itself knew we had returned. The detective moved slowly through the hallway. Flashlight beam cutting through dust in the air. The same footprints were still on the floor. But something new caught his attention. Fresh ones. Someone had entered the house after we left. Or someone had been inside the entire time. We reached the back room again. The open wall leading to the hidden tunnel was exactly where we left it. The detective pointed his flashlight inside. "Police," he called. No response. Just silence. But the camera alert on his phone continued blinking. Motion detected. We crawled into the passage. The narrow tunnel felt even smaller now. The lights inside the hidden room were still on. But something had changed. The photos on the wall. Some of them were missing. My photos. The detective stepped into the hidden room first. Then suddenly stopped. His flashlight beam froze on something in the corner. I moved closer and saw what he was staring at. A chair, placed directly in front of the wall, facing the photos. And on the chair was a person. For a split second, I thought it was a mannequin. The figure wasn't moving. Head tilted slightly downward. Hair long and messy. Clothes dirty and worn. Exactly like the man from the attic camera. The detective raised his weapon. "Don't move," he shouted. The figure slowly lifted its head and looked directly at us. It was him. The same thin face. The same pale eyes. The same quiet smile. For years he had been hiding in walls, living above ceilings, watching people live their lives. And now, he was sitting calmly in front of us, like he had been expecting this moment. "You finally found the room," he said softly. His voice was exactly the same as I remembered. The whisper from the attic. The voice from the video. The detective stepped closer. Hands where I can see them. But the man didn't move. He just looked at me. Not the detective. Me. "I told you I lived here," he said. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "Why me?" I asked. The words escaped my mouth before I could stop them. For the first time, the man's smile widened slightly. "Because you noticed." The detective moved forward to handcuff him. But suddenly, the lights inside the hidden room flickered. Then went dark. Everything happened in seconds. The detective's flashlight dropped to the floor. The room filled with darkness. I heard movement. A struggle. Then a loud crash. When the emergency lights finally turned back on. The room was empty. The chair was knocked over. The wall of photos had been torn apart. And the hidden tunnel was open again, leading deeper into darkness. The detective ran forward with his flashlight. But the passage split into multiple directions. Different tunnels branching through the walls. He looked back at me. "He's gone." Despite everything. Despite finding him face to face. The man disappeared again. Just like every other time. Weeks passed. The police sealed the duplex. Investigators searched the tunnels. But they never found him. Not a trace. Not a fingerprint. Not a single clue about where he went. Eventually, the case was closed. Officially, the report said something simple. Suspect escaped. Life slowly returned to normal again. I moved to another city. Started a new job. A new apartment. A new routine. And for a long time, nothing strange happened. Until one night. Months later. When I woke up suddenly. For no clear reason. The room was dark. Silent. Then I heard it. A sound above the ceiling. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Walking across the attic floor. My entire body went cold. because I already knew that sound. Then something else happened. A quiet whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. The same voice. Daniel. And the final words came from directly above my bed. I found you again. Ghost, the end.